We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Hasan Rafiq. He is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Newsela. Hasan, it's so good to see you. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. So my name is Hasan Rafiq. Pronouns are he, him, his. And I still remember when I was growing up, my father was in the military, my brother was in the military. I wanted to go into the military. But for some reason, I took a different path into HR. But if I were to go back and look at who do I want to be or where would I build my career, it would be in the military. And it was primarily because of the discipline and the consciousness that I saw in my father and my brother as they were growing their own careers in the military, as well as the training that they gave me over the years.
I love that. And you fast forward to today, you said you went on the path of HR and now you're helping to really lead the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy at Newsela. Like any person in an organization, folks are at different points of their kind of equity journey. Tell me about how you would describe where Newsela is as an organization in that DEIB journey.
Yeah, so Newsela is a very, very interesting place to be. It's a community of very, very passionate individuals who are on a mission to build meaningful classroom learning for every student. When I say every student, we literally mean every student. And if you look at the mission, equity or diversity or inclusion is embedded in the way we think about everything. So when I joined Newsela, what I realized, what was unique about Newsela was not just the top down, but also the bottom up. So there are three distinct things that stood out for me. One was passion, which you find in many organizations. And that passion is shared not just by the leadership, it's going down to the IC level and realizing that we need to move the needle, we need to create more inclusion. And the more I heard from our ICs, the more I was convinced that, you know what, here we don't have to think about passion or commitment. It's already there. It's the action that we need to think about. And that was also very amazing to see that not just from a representation perspective, that it's not a numbers game, right? It's the difficult part of this conversation is how do we create those moments of inclusion on a day-to-day basis? But we need to have a data-driven approach to achieving representation first. Once we get there, then we can also start to look at what does it look like. So from my perspective, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I consider inclusion and belonging as a pie in the sky. It's a never-ending journey because no matter how much training you get, how much coaching you get, there are moments when you are going to say something which you didn't intended, but it will have unintended consequences. So there will be an exclusion-inclusion moment in there. So what I realized was the leadership is not just passionate about this, they are committed to it and are driving actions. We need to look at it much more from a systemic perspective where equity is embedded in every process that we conduct for our employees, for our people. And then the larger part is how do we embed that into our products? So the people who are using our products, which are our students, our teachers, feel included, can see themselves in the products that they're using.
I think that is really important. And also there's a huge opportunity, as you were talking about, to have that passion internally and externally with the product and services that you provide as well. And you mentioned really belonging and inclusion being pie in the sky or really a journey. You're always continuously learning, which I think is so important in these conversations and also in our webinars when we're talking about these strategies. What is your philosophy around measuring, the success impact of DEIB initiatives, knowing that we don't want to rely on metrics to say, we want to check a box here, but we also know that what gets measured also gets invested in and things like that?
Yeah, so central to that idea is data, right? So you can have a data-driven strategy, but I always look at data tells us one part of the story. The other part of the story is the sentiment. It's the lived experience. So if you look at an organization, who holds the most lived experiences of our employees as a whole, and then also for our marginalized communities. That is central to a manager's ability to engage with everyone with equity and inclusion, right? So first piece of that is data. If you don't see any representation, if you cannot see someone who's like you at the top, then it is highly likely that you don't belong here. That's the signal you're getting. It may not be true. So representation starts first. And it's more than just recruiting people, because that's just one step of the journey. If we think that we will just recruit a lot of people from the marginalized communities and we'll be fine, the whole approach is flawed. The reason why I say that is every organization starts there, because you can bring in more diversity quickly and easily, even though sometimes it's harder to attract diverse talent. So data-driven approach there in looking at top of funnel, how are we putting processes in place where if we are asking agencies, they're giving us a diverse slate of candidates. It's a short list, long list where diverse representation exists. So you can get through that one process. The second part of the journey is the most interesting, because that's where you start to see equitable systems being developed. When I say that, what I mean by that is every single process that touches our employees needs to be looked at from a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging lens. What do I mean by that is, if you're promoting, is your promotion representative? This is not to say that, you know what, just start promoting anyone, but just because we want representation. This is to say you're making certain decisions. Are you pausing to check if any of the bias came into how people gave you feedback about their reports? Do you see any misrepresentation in terms of the conversations that you're having in talent reviews? Do you see any opportunity where succession planning was not looked at from a DEIB lens? And we have the number 2 and a number 3 layer that looks exactly like what the leadership looks like. All of those are opportunities for leaders to say, we are committed. Now, here is the data that is showing us there is a gap. What are we going to do about it? It's not the DEIB team's responsibility to create that action plan. It's the leader's responsibility. So you can have a very strong data-driven approach in the middle, which is where every process needs to be looked at that way. Pay equity is also a part of it. And then the last portion is where sometimes organizations don't pay a lot of attention to is when you look at your departures, are you disaggregating the data? Because we can easily say departures for our BIPOC employees was this much. Now you slice that data by each ethnicity and you start to see there is a gap between departures as well. So what are we going to do about it? Those who have left, but it is important for us to look at the whole data approach with the sentiment approach. So the second layer that I bring in, which is very important, is the lived experience of people that we already have, which is understanding how they are feeling about when people are promoted. How are they feeling about their career? Are they able to grow their career in this organization, in this department or not? And all of that is also not the DEIB team's responsibility. It is the leader's responsibility to say, I want to understand what the lived experience is. And if it is different, why is it different? What would I do as part of my action plan to make sure that the lived experience is not different? That is the most difficult thing to do, because you can have all the data on one side, it's telling you a story, you can disaggregate that too. But there is a reason why we are called human beings and not human doings. Human beings have sentiments, they have emotions. And it's imperative for leaders to understand how they will engage with those emotions, how they will learn about their lived experiences, and more importantly, what are they going to do about it? Because responsibility and accountability lies with the leader to make sure that that changes, the environment changes. They are the culture carriers of their own department and ultimately the organization.
I definitely agree that leaders have this huge opportunity to build in more equity into their processes. And I think that goes back to your earlier point of you can have the best intentions, you can be really passionate about it, but in those moments of change and commitment every day for promotion, succession planning, really building out your team, are you checking in on that bias as you were talking about and really taking a pause in preparation for our interview. I know I was reading your bio and your experiences in HR and DEI, and I know you've led diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at large enterprise global organizations. And we talk about, for example, diversity in the United States is different than how we define diversity in Japan or other countries as well. What needs to be really global and what needs to stay local in order to be effective and being intentional, not to take this super Western lens to this work?
So my career is built on exactly that. Because if you look at the background that I have, starting from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Middle East, North Africa, Europe, Asia, and then came to the US. And throughout, I have struggled personally with how we not just define diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, but also how we do most of the work in a certain way, which is great in the sense that it brings more focus. But I'll give you an example, a very simple one. I was part of the Center of Excellence for DEIB, and majority of the team was sitting in the New York office and the London office, and we would have conversations on diversity. So San Francisco would share their numbers, more than 90 nationalities, thousands of people. New York, similar story. London, similar story. And then they would turn to me and say, what does diversity look like in the Middle East, North Africa? And my response sometimes would shock them. And I would say, right now, I have got more than 7,000 people. Let's zoom in on one country, one city. I've got 1,500 people in this office. We've got more than 200 nationalities. Almost 90% of the people in the country are expats. How do I do DEIB in this place, which is the most diverse? And our traditional way of defining DEIB or diversity is not going to work here, because you can't separate people by ethnicity, because we've got more than 200. You can still look at a number of things. So when I pause and I step back, I always look at what's the context here. And sometimes where we fall short in the Western world is when we look at best practices as always universal. I consider best practices as always contextual. They're not universal. For example, if something works really well in US and I want to replicate that same in another part of the world, I need to literally rip it apart and put it back together for that part of the world to really understand what works. The second component of this is the lived experience. Why do I go back to lived experience? As a global DEI team, the first question you should be asking yourself is, who do we have on our team who has lived experiences of doing this work across the globe? And that ties back into not just dropping for 2 weeks or a month in another country and staying there and learning about their culture or their differences. It's living in that country for at least 6 to 8 months, navigating the neighborhood, navigating the grocery store, navigating the nuances that are there when it comes to traffic or the people and how people engage or don't engage, what kind of conversations you have. You learn about so much differences. So if I were to summarize, I would summarize it into 2 buckets. The first one is visible diversity, which is most of the Western world has focused a lot on visible diversity because it is required. It's a great start. It helps progress, brings focus. Gender, ethnicity, race, those are some of the things that we can look at. And you can argue some of those are only US centric. They are not even beyond US and other Western parts of the world because you can't collect the data. But the important part here is that is important because you can see the diversity. Where I go or where I specialize in is the invisible diversity, diversity that we cannot see. A very simple example. You and I are engaging in this conversation. There are a couple of things that I can't see. How you think, I can't see that. How you perceive, how you come to conclusions, how you make decisions, your interaction style. Most importantly, how your brain functions. And if we are a manager-employee relationship, I may be unintentionally creating exclusion for you by not being curious about how you operate, because that's the whole part of your diversity. I'll give you a very simple example. I was coaching a senior leader and he said, you know what, on these global calls, people don't ask good questions, and sometimes they don't even engage. They just nod and say yes, and then later on I realized they really did not agree with the whole process or whatever we were talking about. So I said, this is an important aspect because he's a great champion for diversity. And I said, let's look at how you design your calls, because that's important. So I asked him a few questions. It turns out the calls are designed with, here is what we want to discuss. Here's the agenda, open debate. Let's talk about it, and we'll talk through it, which is a classical Western individual accountability driven way to engage in a conversation. So I asked him, are you interested in getting input from everyone else? And he said, yes. And I said, so then you have to redo how you design your calls, because open debate is great for some people. Silent reflection works for others. Because you're interested in their input, doesn't matter who's speaking and when they're speaking, how much they're speaking, how much they're contributing. They can silently reflect and give you input. And it does not have to be in the moment. It can be afterwards. Similarly, we discovered quite a few other differences, like stylistic differences, language differences, cultural differences. You can't see most of these, but you'll experience. So I look at it as you need both. It's not an either or. If you're designing a global DEIB strategy, think of them as polarities, global and local. And there is an infinity loop between these two polarities. If you focus too much on being global and Western lens of doing DEIB and replicating that across the globe, it is highly likely you'll get a downside for it instead of the upside of it. And if you create the and, which is where this goes to, global and local, it's not either or, it's an and. So global and local, you start to see the upside of what works locally and how do we amplify that. And trust me, there is so much learning from the rest of the world that we can do, because when you bring in these language, stylistic differences, you increase more engagement between people. You make them more curious about the whole person versus just one identity that they have. And we have so many identities. And that also helps us in creating a culture where I am curious, I am empathetic, I'm giving you this space for how you want to communicate, and the focus is on you. And it comes back to the lived experience of everyone. Do I feel included here? That feeling cannot be quantified in numbers. Yes, you can do a survey and find out, but it's those moments that are more crucial for people to feel like they're seen, heard, and valued. You can easily create the seen, heard very quickly. I can see you, I can hear you, but if I don't value your input, there will not be a lot of inclusion or belonging for that individual, because they can now be seen, they are heard, but we are just listening. We are not actioning what they're asking. So balance between global and local comes with when we start to look at lived experiences of people who are doing this work across the globe and making them part of our team. And also, how would we balance between what works in US and what works in Dubai, and how we do that in a consistent way?
Yeah, I mean, I love that example that you provided just based on the meeting style as well, and how people interact and how comfortable people feel giving feedback on the spot in a large group, one-on-one, or need time to process that as well. And you really want to, again, take a pause and say, why isn't, people giving feedback in this specific setting? Maybe we should shift things around, and what works in one, even office in the US to another office might not work too. So I think that's really important to remember. Another kind of really specific example I wanted to ask you about too is when you were at EY and you designed and deployed a belonging hackathon, which sounds fun, to activate really that greater sense of belonging and ownership for folks across the company. As you talked about, it's not one person or one team's responsibility, especially in HR or a DEI team, to ensure that the entire company feels like they belong. Tell us about the goal of the Belonging Hackathon and what were some of the results.
Yeah, so you might have also seen I stayed with EY for 13 years. It's because when you find a sponsor, a mentor, who just makes sure that you get the experiences of growing your career. I found that very early on in Jeannie Carlier, who's now the vice chair for talent for Americas. And she is very, very passionate about inclusion. When I say passionate, I mean real passionate. And EY has been doing this work for almost 30, more than 30 plus years. And what we started to see in the West region, half of the country, as it is designed from a perspective of EY as a function. I was heading up DEIB there, and she asked me, we keep on hearing about belonging a lot. What is it? And how can we get to the bottom of it? And my plain response to her was, it's a very, very squishy thing. It means different things for different people. If you talk about inclusion, you can still somewhat quantify it. Belonging, you cannot quantify. She said, that's a good problem to have, because we would like to try and figure out how do we go there and explore what we can learn from it. How can we grow in that space? If it requires research, let's do research. And I said, well, we can absolutely commission research, which we did, but it's about our people. And we need to learn from them. What does belonging mean to them? And I also have a very strong passion for design thinking, because it just takes away the whole aspect of me being an expert. And I don't consider anyone an expert in the DEIB space. Something like that does not exist. Nobody's an expert in the DEIB space, or just an expert. The reason for that is, when you create a process that is inclusive by design, and you create opportunities for people to have real conversation on belonging, you are able to draw out something that is most important to them and is individualized. That's the hard part of belonging. It's very, very individual. Something that creates belonging for me may not create belonging for you. So as a manager, how do I need to navigate this when everyone is looking for something different? Well, the first start is being curious about it. So what we did was, we designed a belonging hackathon to bring diverse group of people together, first in the US, to understand and go deeper into what enables belonging for them. And as a result, we were able to create multiple products that came out of that hackathon. One of them was a belonging jigsaw game. And that's like a physical game of 16 jigsaw puzzle pieces. And the reason why they were 16 were those 16 words were the biggest word in our word cloud as we were going through the how might we exercise and ideating on what does belonging mean, what does it mean behaviorally, and so on. And then that's where, again, I'll bring in the global and local lens, is it was a hit. People loved it, and it had a whole nudge engine behind it. And when I say that, what I mean is, you go through the exercise, solving that puzzle, you have your top three, bottom three belonging indicators, top three that create the most belonging, bottom three that erodes belonging for you. And then you have a measurable and actionable behavior that you're going to write yourself and submit. And then the nudge engine gives you reminders of, are you doing that behavior for others? Are others doing that behavior for you? So you have real life engagement on a topic. When we took that to other parts of the world, we realized we failed. And the reason for that was, it was designed with certain words in mind. And there were different words that started to come up. And we realized, well, why is that? Why do people think differently? Even though the representation in our main hackathon was very well represented, but there were certain other behaviors that people were looking for when they feel a sense of belonging. For example, one of the words was assimilated. And I thought to myself, if I am assimilated in something, I don't feel like I belong. I'm just being like someone else. The other word was elevated. So elevated means you're elevating someone else. So it means less elevation for others. What's going on? So we became, again, very curious about, why are these words important to people? What's the behavior behind it? And what we discovered was, in our shared service centers, there are smaller teams. When a global project originates from US and we request those teams to be part of those projects, they feel a sense of belonging, because now they are much more elevated. They are more assimilated into something bigger than themselves. So it was, again, an individual community where me, or as an individual, does not matter that much. I'm part of something bigger than myself that is creating a sense of belonging. So we had to redo some of the work that we did to make it more global. And that learning experience was fantastic. As a result of that, we also won the Great Places to Work Award for Innovation and Leadership. And there were so many fascinating conversations that sparked that, because if you are able to use design thinking in an effective way, you can design anything with inclusion at the center of it, because it's not dependent on an expert. It's people are crafting something that they will use later on, which for me is a success.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. You can design anything with that lens of inclusion. And also, it's important to really think about when you are designing anything. I appreciate that you brought up design thinking as well within our conversation, too, because I think that's also really powerful as well. I also would love to ask, I know when we were speaking about this episode, we were thinking about, just other examples as well of how Newsela is really leaning into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of them was how Newsela was honoring and celebrating Pride this year, which is in June. And this is something that I definitely did want to ask you, because we know that it's really important to highlight these topics not only in June, but also 365 days a year. So tell me more about that.
So our affinity group that is part of Pride is very, very active, and it is active throughout the year. I consider any of those moments, these are cultural moments for us, they are important throughout the year. And the dialogue that originates from it helps us in understanding, at the heart of it is the lived experience. So how are we creating spaces for people to share more and more about their lived experience inside of the organization as well as outside of the organization? So we had a full activity that we did, but one of my recommendations to the group was, how do we continue this momentum? And now we are working towards, this is an ongoing dialogue for every community, so that we can understand the lived experiences of each other. And then more importantly, our communities, especially our affinity and ERG groups, inform our strategy. When I say inform, I use that word lightly. They shape our strategy, because they have a direct input into how we are thinking about inclusion. They have a direct input in creating processes that create more equity. And on top of that, they are represented in our DEIB council, which means that's the body that our executive leadership engages with, I engage with, to understand, here is what we are trying to do in the DEIB space. Number one, do you agree with this is going to work? Because like I said, I'm not an expert. Nobody's an expert. We need as many perspectives as possible. And then also, if you have a month and you do a lot of events during a month, and we don't continue that momentum, it is highly likely that people will then limit it to a month, which is not going to help, especially if it is about conversations on lived experiences and the change that we want to bring within the organization and outside of the organization. So for any community, my recommendation is, it's not a one-day event or a one-month event. It is, how do we continue the momentum, and how do we create spaces for you to give us input so that we can learn about what is happening in the system and then grow from there.
I definitely agree with that. And I think that continues on the theme of continuously learning, continuing the conversation, and intentionally creating those spaces and iterating on them as well. Hassan, is there anything that I didn't ask throughout our conversation that you'd like to highlight, or any kind of key insights you hope people bring with them after hearing our conversation today?
No, thank you so much for the opportunity, and kudos to you and team for doing these. I think I have listened to all of them and they are very informative. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I really enjoyed our conversation. And as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in folks being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.